People are creating intellectual property all the time, and people are building companies on intellectual property. Intellectual property is like wolves. It's much more effective in packs. There are established, credible, reliable models that exist to quantify the value of intellectual property. Buyers are much more interested in buying intellectual property that has demonstrated that it can generate revenue and do so profitably. While it is possible to sell intellectual property at the idea or conceptual phase, it's much more difficult to do. It's considered higher risk, and therefore is going to attract a smaller pool of buyers and as a result, a lower price. Intellectual property works best when it is in a bundle of intellectual property assets. Intellectual property is like wolves. It's much more effective in packs, whereas it is possible to monetize or sell a single isolated patent. It is generally much more attractive to buyers to buy a portfolio of related patents because those patents, generally speaking, bring the opportunity to protect one another. And even if one patent, for example, or a claim on one patent is invalidated, it's possible that the remaining claims on the remaining patents will maintain the viability of the underlying business. The intellectual property should exist in an ecosystem of other assets. It's much more valuable if it is tied to, for example, the expertise of the inventors, or if it's tied to an existing market of buyers and information about potential or existing customers, if it's connected with a powerful brand or a powerful following on social media. These kinds of things enhance the value of intellectual property, and it's not necessarily limited to a patent. That also applies to trade secrets, to software, to data. Almost any asset is more valuable when it draws value from other assets that work in connection with it. A lot of people ask me, what about the threat of the intellectual property being stolen or somehow invalidated? This question has taken up much more importance in light of the America Invents Act of the last decade and the establishment of PTAB, or the Patent Trial and Appeals Board. Without a doubt, the Patent Trial and Appeals Board and features of the AIA make the ownership of intellectual property more difficult, more risky, and potentially more expensive, because what can happen is that the government, after issuing a patent, can basically do an instant replay and decide that the patent is not valid at all. In addition, a deep-pocketed predatory company can decide they're going to infringe upon your intellectual property and dare you to sue them and force you to come up with millions of dollars to pursue a court process, not only to win the initial trial, but to win the inevitable series of appeals that will take place afterward. And while these things are true, I think it's too cynical to take the view that intellectual property as a whole all of a sudden has no value. People are creating intellectual property all the time, and people are building companies on intellectual property. They are deciding, for whatever reason, that it's worth the risk to invent something and bring it to the world and commercialize it. I do think that an intellectual property that has survived a legal challenge of some kind and therefore has demonstrated some sort of resiliency within the legal process or the judicial system, I do think that adds additional value. An intellectual property must be accompanied by an expectation that you will be called upon to defend it, and therefore the necessity to set aside funds to defend that intellectual property ought to factor into that valuation. But that doesn't mean the intellectual property has lost all value, in spite of the fact that the America Invents Act has been in effect for about a decade or so. Hundreds of thousands of patents are being granted in the United States each year. I just don't think that the market is so dumb that everybody is creating these assets, either oblivious or in spite of the fact that there's some sort of sense of certainty that it's going to be destroyed. While I empathize with those who feel like they have had their IP stolen, that perhaps their legal counsel did not give them the full information they needed to assess whether or not it was worth pursuing intellectual property because they were not fully informed of the risks of doing so. I think that by walking away from intellectual property altogether, that's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And in fact, that's what we're seeing, even though patent applications have slowed somewhat. Again, the patent office is still approving 300 to 400,000 patents a year. Once you've established that your intellectual property may have some value, there's a common perception that you can't properly value intellectual property. And that's not exactly true. Intellectual property is more difficult to assign a value to than, say, jewelry or paintings or a business or securities within a business. There are established, credible, reliable models that exist to quantify the value of intellectual property. Of course, like any valuation model, there is some level of uncertainty. There's some level of flexibility that must be applied to those models and to the results of those models in order to enable good business decision making. But they do exist, and the nature of the model that you use will depend on the nature of the asset and on the data available. Thanks for watching this installment of Your Business Value. And if you received value from this video, please subscribe and let me know in the comments what topics you would like me to cover next.